I want to thank Peter and the board for having me and for giving me an opportunity to talk. It was my 40th birthday yesterday, and so Peter gave me a trip to London. And the pressure's on for my 50th birthday, Peter. Anyway, when Peter called me and gave me this opportunity, I said, well, I'm not sure you're talking to the right person, because frequently I get more credit in international than I deserve, because Darius is nice enough to publish in accounting journals with the name Miller. But the fact of the matter is, if you look at the other three people on this panel, I would say that they make their living thinking about international things. And really, I play in the area occasionally, and the fact of the matter is I've become a little frustrated with the area and haven't played in it much recently. And Peter said, well, that's okay, you can say that as well. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to take a few cheap shots at the people actually doing the work. I should say that all of these cheap shots apply to the work that I've done previously and will apply to the work that I'll do in the future as well. But I hope that maybe by taking some of the things that other people have brought up and thinking a little bit about why we end up there, we can move the literature forward somewhat, which would be good for all of us, particularly those of us who hope to get what we're doing in print. I feel like a game show host. I've never had one of these things before. I'm going to call some of you down in a minute. So what I'm going to do is, the other people did a very nice job of kind of having their talks flow, but the fact of the matter is mine are kind of three loosely related things that have always irritated me. And since I have the microphone, I'm going to stand up here and talk about them. And the first is this idea of defining international research. And I'll go into that in just a moment. And then a question of whether this literature stalled. And finally, even if we can agree on a definition and we can get the literature unstalled, because obviously my answer is yes to that, there's this big challenge of selling this work and getting it published. So to start with, what is international research? Those of you who've had to spend some time with me know, Eddie knows I bring this up about every 2 weeks.
More often.
Yeah, well, recently more often at least. And it's interesting when you ask people, what is international research? Because you get all sorts of different definitions. And a lot of the times I think, quite frankly, they just don't express, don't show that the people have spent a lot of time thinking about this. People will say things like, well, it's research done outside the US, because the US is where most research is done. Or, it's, and I always look at that and think, so if somebody in Spain does a paper on Spain, that's international, right? And a lot of people will answer yes, actually, if you ask them that question. Research done outside the author's country, because I've moved internationally myself then. Research where the data happens to be from more than one country. So the best way to answer this question is to have variation in data, and I'm going to call that international. These are all very data-driven sorts of ideas of what's international. And then, finally you get to the thing where, well, maybe it's research that has implications for global information flows. And the really shocking part is, you would be surprised by how often people say, well, international research is stuff that people who do international research have done. So it's really this portfolio sort of thing, and they'll start pointing to individual people instead. So I guess they get credit even for US stuff then. So I've tried to put together a little bit of a framework, and as I was sitting here listening to the other three, I realized there's at least one bullet point missing here. But I would say the first two of these, in my mind, are truly what I would call international research. The first are the slam dunk sort of studies, where you've got data from a whole bunch of different countries. And the question is clearly something about international investment flow or information flow. And the example that I would give is the Kovrig, DeFond, and Hung paper, which is a JAR paper, and it had an excellent editor. In that paper, what they did was take a look at IFRS adoption. And they had investments from a bunch of different countries, and they had companies in a bunch of different countries. And they were able to do some really nice tests on when this can lead to investment from people outside of your country. So you can see that's a very international question, and they're using data from a whole bunch of different countries. Now, it doesn't mean that you have to have data from a whole bunch of different countries, though. I think that when we define these things based on data, that's where we start to make mistakes. I think there's a lot of research that actually only has data from one country. But they're asking a question where the implications are about international information flow or investment flow. And I would still call those as international. And I'll give you two examples there. The Bradshaw, Boucher, and Miller paper, where we want to look at, can having accounting that's familiar to investors get you more foreign investment. But we only had US investment. So while we had investment in a whole bunch of different countries, we really only had investment from one country. That limited the ability of some of the things we could say, but throughout that paper, which also had an excellent editor, throughout that paper, we really tried to stick with the fact that the question is international, and we're comfortable giving caveats to what we can't say because we've only got one country, but we were not comfortable with being pushed towards the idea of, let's just make this about what do US investors prefer. We wanted to focus on the international. Doug Skinner has a paper on deferred taxes in Japan, and he started that project, and I know I talked with him about it before he ever wrote anything, with the question, if you've got very similar accounting standards. In Japan, they had a one-paragraph deferred tax standard that said, do it like the US. So you would expect to get a very similar application. And again, this is a question we've heard several people bring up over the last 2 days. But he said in Japan, the political environment is so different that what I want to understand is how does the political environment interact with this standard stuff and see whether we get a different answer there. So he started this as a very international question, even though he only had one country, Japan. Now, the next set of studies I think are very interesting studies. They use data from a country that's not the US, but I don't think that they're international studies. They're studies where somebody says, there's something that one country does that's unique, and by looking in that country, I can understand a general accounting question better. And one of my favorite papers about this is Bernard Merton and Palapoo. And maybe it's one of my favorite papers because I got to hear Vic tell me about it, and so I actually understand it, versus other papers are harder for me. But this paper is about fair market values. And what they did was get data in Denmark where the banks apply fair market value accounting. And they used that to take a look at whether managers were going to manipulate, is it more informative? And these are all questions we've asked multiple times. They're questions we're asking now about the fair value literature. They have not much to do with international. It just happened that the international data was the way to use it. And I think, again, you want to be very careful about why is it we did this study and what do we get out of this study. And then there's the data point that I think I'm missing here, which would be when you have data from lots of countries, but the question still is a general accounting question. And if you think of some of the stuff that Lloyd Sue was talking about, or some of the stuff Craig was talking about, they didn't say these are international questions. They said, because of international variation, I can study this question. And so I think we need to put another data point in there and say, again, we want to be careful about whether we call that international. It might face a lot of the same issues that international studies do because of the data, but the question's not international, and if we're careful about that, I think it can, as I'll show in a moment, lead to different ways to approach some of the questions. Then there's a set of studies that really irritate me, which I'll call the also here studies. These are the, well, there was post-earnings announcement drift in the US, and then somebody did it in the UK, and then somebody showed it in Peru, and by God, I've got Korean data, so I'm going to show it there as well. With no reason why we would expect it to be different, no reason that we would expect to learn anything from it this way. Now, don't get me wrong, there's lots of times where going to other countries can help us understand. The studies in Japan on the January effect. People were saying the January effect is because of taxes. So they said, well, they have different tax years in Japan. Let's see if it's there. Turned out it was there. So we didn't learn what caused the January effect, but we did learn one thing that didn't. That's not an also there study. I would say that falls into the category above it. But it's amazing how many of these also here studies are there. In fact, I kept track on SSRN over the last 3 weeks, and there were at least 5 of these studies that came across SSRN. I chose not to put the names up there because there's already enough people that don't like me. So why should we quibble about this? Is this something, and a lot of people have told me, look, you're trying to put your own framework on this, you're trying to force people to think your way. We shouldn't get in the way of people doing interesting research. And this is a lot of people who I think do good international research. But I think there's a lot of reasons that we should. And the first, and I think really important one, is the fact of the matter is, although I like international research, it has a bad reputation. It really does. It has a reputation as a lot of it being very low quality work. And I know, talking to some of the people who are on the advisory board for CARE even, that they share that belief. And it's because they're seeing so much of this also here literature. When you probe people on what they think is the negative stuff, it usually is this also here sort of stuff. So I think if we're carefuler about what we really think is important international research, we can help reach out and hopefully attract not just more readers, but more people working in the area. The next is that I think we make motivation hard for ourselves when we're not careful about what we think is international and what is not. Because you write a paper on cost of capital where you use this variation, and it can be a fascinating paper, but if you're also trying to carry into that all of the international literature, I mean, I find when I write papers and I start to get confused myself about this, then I feel like I have to tie into every international paper that was ever written to show how it fits into this flow. And it just ends up making it very confusing. Beyond the fact that it makes motivation difficult, I also think it would keep authors more honest if they hold themselves up to a framework like this and say, what can I really say and what can I not say? And so in the Bradshaw et al., it kept us honest along with an editor and a referee who kept us honest on what can we say and what can we not say as we think about where we fit into this international literature. The Bernard et al. Paper, the last section is implications for the United States. And they make it very clear that this study was done in order to provide implications to the US. So I don't have to worry about, does it generalize to Israel or Japan or someplace where there's weak investor protections, etc. So by keeping the authors honest on what they could say here and what they couldn't say, it helps us get more out of the research. I also think that the fact of the matter is we who do this research could do a better job of research design and thinking about our questions if we stopped and told ourselves, let's not get excited that we're doing international. Let's think about these components and how it fits together. And particularly in the research design choice, I think if we really focused on what's the question I'm trying to answer, we often would go about the design in a different way. And I'll touch on that in another one of my rants. Finally, I found that readers and editors and referees can easily get lost. And I probably should have cleared this with Joe before I put it up there. But I can think of, I saw Joe present his Bushman and Piotrowski paper in 2 conference settings. Now, my interpretation of what they were trying to say in that paper, which is a paper that looks at conservatism around the world, is they were trying to look at, we've got globally different institutions. Let's look at how these institutions that differ globally end up relating to this conservatism that we know a lot about and see how institutions develop together, which to me is a very international question because it was looking at different ways these things can come together. And they were going to pains to say, it's not that one system's right or wrong, we're just trying to understand how they develop together. Relatively accurate? But both times that I saw Joe present it, the audience thought it was a paper about conservatism. And so they wanted to take him down a completely different road. They wanted a completely different set of tests. Those of you who were at the JE conference, Wayne Gay got up and gave a great discussion about different ways conservatism can manifest and what does that mean. But it was a discussion about, are we trying to understand conservatism? Which was equally interesting, and you could take the data and do that paper, but was not the paper the authors were trying to do. And so I think if we can be carefuler up front and get a more established view of what international is, it's less likely that we're going to get railroaded that way. And I know Doug's paper is the same thing. Every time he presents it, it ends up being a banking paper. And Doug keeps saying, I'm not a banking expert, I'm not trying to write a banking paper. And it's been frustrating for him and makes me glad that I chose not to co-author on it. So the next rant, are we stalled? Of course, I think the answer is yes. But I think what's really useful is to think about how we ended up stalled. And there's a paper that I really like, Bamber, Christensen, and Gaver. I make the PhD students read it. If I could make all of you read it, I would. But it's a very nice paper that basically shows 1 or 2 papers get written in an area. They take a certain approach, both in method and in thought process. And it's amazing how quickly we solidify around that and we say that's the consensus of what we're going to do. We start calling it things like seminal work, and we never move on from that. And I think that the predictions that they make, you can see very clearly in the international literature. First of all, if we think about the approaches that we take in the literature, the vast majority of the research falls into one of 2 categories. It's either that people do this institution sort of stuff where they take a bunch of these Schleifer sort of variables and they say it's law and finance stuff and they run these cross-sectional tests. And they take the variables out of other people's tables, So my table 2 is from table 7 of that paper. So they're reusing the same variables from the same countries over and over again, but you add one more variable to it sort of stuff. I would say that is actually the vast majority of papers, particularly if we look at our finance brethren and add them into the mix as well. And then in accounting, there's this other set of papers or other approach that we have as well, which is, gee, I'd like to know something about standards. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to get a whole bunch of measures, and we usually call it quality. Now, some of us, like Mark Bradshaw and I, we equivocated on that a little bit and said, oh, these are just properties of accounting. We're not even going to argue about whether they're quality. But still, we get this set of measures, and everybody uses the same set of measures, and none of us really know what the hell they measure. But you can cite that other people use them, and you just see, do they differ across different regimes, and then you reach a conclusion based on that. That's pretty much the conclusion you started with anyway. And I have to say, I haven't seen any paper where they all go the directions they're supposed to anyway. And sometimes I can't figure out how two of them go, and it's like they're completely opposite of each other. We have higher variance, but it's more predictable accounting, that sort of stuff. But these are the two approaches that we take. And when you take these, you're safe. The Bradshaw and Miller paper, we started with a different approach, using a SIR and having just one measure that we thought was a much more sound approach. And we were beaten because it's only one measure. How do we know that that says anything? This isn't how we do the research. You really need to do it this other way because that's the way the research is done. And I hate to say, actually, I had lunch with Peter and was talking about it when I presented at Notre Dame, and he told me, if you give in, it will always bother you. And we gave in, and it bothers me. It probably wouldn't have if Peter hadn't told me that. Thanks, Peter. But not only are we stalled in approach, and by being stalled in approach, I think we leave a lot of interesting questions on the table, but I think even worse, we are stalled in thought process. And by thought process, I mean there's these early findings, and this is exactly what the Bamber et al. Paper says would happen. We could re-examine them. We've got much better data now. We've got much better ways of doing things. But you get no credit if you go back and re-examine these. And in fact, if you find something different from what those earlier findings were, you can't get it published. So I actually don't agree with Craig's statement that we've done this with a whole bunch of different variables that look at investor protection and we get the same results. I agree if I look at the published work, that's true. But there's a whole bunch of papers that have just died on the vine or have ended up switching the question and getting around a different way, Bradshaw and Miller included, because you find something that's different from these prior findings, and we just seem to be set that those are the true findings. We ignore not only innovations in the thought process here, but also innovations in methodology. And legal origins is one that Craig already brought up a little bit, but I want to give you a little more detail on that. It is true, as he said, if you talk to legal scholars, they will tell you that that stuff does not measure legal. There's a person at Columbia who went through a bunch of different countries in detail and said, I don't know anything about econometrics, but I do know the law, and I can tell you that you wouldn't come up with these rankings if you had somebody who knew the law do them. Then there's a guy at Harvard Law School, Rose, and Rose said, look, the fact of the matter is these are completely correlated with whether you were invaded during World War II. And so I can put it in as that measure and I get the same result because they're basically coded exactly the same. But if it's law and this stuff's been around for hundreds of years, I should be able to run it in 1910. And in 1910 I should get the same results we're getting in 2000. But that was before we were invaded. So it turns out if you run it in 1910, the results don't work. The stock market in Austria actually was much better than the stock market in the UK, for example. So that works out there, but we all just ignore it because we're set with what the legal stuff means. Now you can say, well, I can't keep up with this legal scholar stuff, and those guys talk funny anyway. But you could also look at again, Joe's work with Bushman. In that paper, we can see that if you put in the dummy variable, it works. Then when they put in their finer measures, the dummy variable doesn't work anymore. And any of us who've worked with the data know that, yeah, the dummy variable works on the first cut. But if you do a few changes with it, the thing can flip signs completely, right? But we all ignore that. We go home and tell ourselves it's okay. And really that's holding us back from learning more interesting things. The theories are the same sort of thing, and the bonding is the one that, to be honest, just drives me crazy. Because if you have a different idea from bonding, people don't want to hear it. I mean, Steve, I think there's fascinating stuff in your paper, but when you put a slide up that says it could be all these other things, but prior literature has attributed this to bonding and used it that way, and that's what I'm going to look at, I think you're passing up on a great opportunity. You can actually test those other things and say, maybe it really is that you get the most benefit when you go where there's other firms in the industry, because there's analysts that understand us. And because we stick to these old theories, we just can't move on in our learning. The bonding one has just morphed amazingly, too. If you go back and read Coffee, it was originally just about legal stuff. But when we started to find that it didn't work quite as well, that there might be other stuff there, people have morphed what bonding means. And they say, well, you know, it could be capital market stuff, it could be this other informal stuff. And so it makes it so we can't move forward and actually explore those other things and call them what they are, because if you don't call it bonding, you run into the bonding mafia. And those guys are tough, and they own journals. So it gets really rough. And then the final thing, and I debated whether to put this one up here because it could make people mad. Then I thought, oh, what the hell. I think what we've done is set up a few experts. And then if you don't do things the way that those people do them, you're considered wrong. It's amazing to me how frequently I see somebody present a good paper, and then somebody says, oh, you know, I remember at a conference, Christian said something different from that. And, you know, I followed up with Christian, and people are always misquoting him anyway. And, you know, I don't think that the experts want this to happen. But I can tell you, you hear Christian, you hear Mark Lang, you know, you just have to do it the ways that these guys do it. And I've talked to both of them. They say, I design tests that match the question I'm trying to ask. You know, I'm going to throw Joe into this category too, because I've started to see it happen where people say, well, you're going to have to do it, you know, Piotrowski does it this way, this is the way you should do it. It's a burden on those people, I think, to try to break that. But I think it's a burden on all of us too, because it's easy to say, let's make it somebody else's responsibility to come up with the way that you're going to do this. And that makes it a lot easier for the rest of us because we don't have to think. But then we end up stuck, and the literature ends up closed and very small. All right, enough of that rant. How do I say that, Joe? I think I have more than that. No, I'll be done in 2 minutes. This is a short slide. Challenges in selling the work. I'm only allowed to do that if I'm the expert. No, but you know, one of the tough things is getting buy-in. And when you present in front of an audience, you know, what you find is that people are either for or against international work, and I think both are equally dangerous for us. Because you get somebody like me who wants to see international work turn out, and I'm willing to cut you so much slack that the paper doesn't get better. And then what ends up happening is because the paper doesn't get better, the people who don't like international work say, exactly, that stuff's crummy, right? So that adds an additional risk. You also have people who don't like the work, who just don't believe we can say anything in international, and that shuts it down as well. And when I say particularly editors, what I mean is when they feel this way, it's particularly a problem for the rest of us, editors. Now, the other thing is everyone has an opinion based on the country they come from or someplace they've traveled, etc. So you put up their table with 45 countries, they raise their hand and say, I spent a week in Israel, and I just don't think that this makes sense. And you can lose an entire presentation based on that. I had that experience with the Bradshaw and Miller in Belgium when somebody was there and pointed that out to us. And we spent 3 months hand collecting data to prove that we were correct on this. 3 months of my life. All right?
You're only 40.
So it's a significant portion. Okay. Then the other problem that you run into is, and Craig talked about this, and so did Lloyd C., you're using data that people aren't familiar with, so they ask you all the questions that we've all agreed not to ask each other about CompuStat and CRISP. So there's that barrier to jump through as well. Then even if you can get past that when you're presenting, you've got to get the things published. And what I found is when I present, people will bring up self-selection, we'll talk about it for a few minutes, and then they'll say, okay, go on. But when I'm having a paper refereed, they end the paper on self-selection. When I'm the other referee on a paper, so you can think, you know, maybe I'm just not a good researcher if it's my experience, but when I'm the other referee on a paper and I'm seeing what the second referee is writing, it's amazing to me how often the referees just say, look, this is self-selection, you cross-listed, you adopted this gap, whatever you did, so we can't learn anything from it. And it just kills the research. Now, the other thing that happens is that refereeing is of uneven quality. And I actually feel bad for the editors here, and I don't frequently feel bad for editors. But I feel bad for them here because they have to make a choice. Do I choose people who understand international data and the problems with that, or do I choose people who understand the phenomena that's being studied? If it's an international governance paper, maybe I can find somebody who understands both, but when 5 people write together, that was it. I mean, that's the literature, right? So now you've got to make that choice. And that puts a real risk on you when you submit a paper. Because the fact of the matter is you're going to get a referee who doesn't understand at least part of what you do. And if you think you've written a good paper, then of course you want a quality referee report because the quality is going to come through. If you think you've written crap, then I guess maybe you're trying to spin the wheel. All right, I don't have a conclusion slide because I anticipated you.
Okay.
So that's pretty much it.
All right.